Hello everyone, today I'm going to be talking about the 1998 film Meet Joe Black, starring Brad Pitt, Anthony Hopkins and Claire Forlani. This channel is not only looking at so-called sacred art or fine art or explicitly religious or spiritual works, but really any work of art in any form that touches on themes of the sacred, the spiritual, beauty in its largest sense, and God. And in this case, the film addresses also themes of death and sacrifice. There will be plot spoilers in this video, so if you haven't seen it, please watch the film first before seeing this video. The initial premise of the film is that death is going to take a human body and have an adventure, really, of the power of love and the love of power. The first character we meet in the film is Anthony Hopkins' rich businessman, surrounded by beautiful things, and he has an encounter which seems at first to be a voice in his head that simply says the word yes. He says he doesn't know what it means, but the voice in his head tells him that he does know what it means. Shortly afterwards, we have a scene in a cafe where a young man meets a young woman, and they really hit it off. They are entranced, no doubt partly by their mutual physical beauty, also by the charm and the humour and chemistry and spontaneous connection that arises between them. I'm reminded of the erotic charge of some of the works of Klimt that also at the same time ultimately conveyed spiritual power, at least as far as I see them, that I talked about in my last video. So, shortly after their encounter in the cafe, the young man is hit by a car, and it looks like it's going to be fatal, which it proves to be. A little while after that, the rich businessman, whose name is Bill, encounters apparently the same young man we saw in the cafe, who reveals himself as Death. And he says to Bill that he is death, the most lasting and significant element in human history. And when he said this in the film, I said out loud to the screen, no, God is, as a Christian. That was my spontaneous response to the idea that death is the most powerful and significant element in human history. In this scene, shortly after that, Bill makes essentially a deal with death, or you could say the devil, that he won't reveal the identity of him as death in exchange for being allowed to live a little longer. And moving on, the character, the Brad Pitt character who Bill eventually decides to call Joe, just the first name that pops into his head, becomes very powerful in Bill's company, because he has Bill over a barrel, so to speak. He's using the power of his ability to take Bill out of life as a bargaining chip so that Bill has to include him in everything he does, all of his business and everything. So he becomes very powerful in Bill's business organisation. And then he encounters the young woman, whose name is Susan again, who is perplexed to see him in this new context, and doesn't really understand that he's suddenly behaving very, very differently. She doesn't know that he is death. And so the second seduction, the scene in the cafe didn't quite achieve the level of seduction. It was intrigue, it was charm, it was a little bit like a first spontaneous sort of a date. And now that death is occupying Brad Pitt's body, he has this power, he has this influence over her father, which I guess impresses her and impresses everyone around them. And he still has the seductive power that she remembers from their first encounter, that's partly to do with his physical attraction and also memories of how he charmed her. And so she obviously thinks he's the same person, but in fact he is death. And so there is a kind of a double seduction going on, which is the seduction of the world and death being amoral or immoral, has no compunction about rising to a level of power that's perhaps unearned, that is unearned in fact. And there is the gradual seduction of Susan by the Joe character. She is perplexed, disturbed by his changing character, but also intrigued and no doubt to some degree seduced by the power and the influence that he seems to have on everyone around him. And physical intimacy ensues. And the actions of death, speaking as a Christian, the actions of death in terms of seducing everybody around him remind me of the power of sin, of the devil, of Satan. And the original meaning of the word Satan in Hebrew is the adversary. I believe it's pronounced Satan in Hebrew. The adversary. Death or Satan or the devil is the opponent of all that is good, of life, of love, of God. And so they get together, and yet she remains unsettled. There's a chill in her to do with how he suddenly disappears for a long time, how he seems completely caught up in the world of power and business, and he's not completely available to her, and he's really not this charming young man who she met in the cafe. And Death is apparently falling in love with her, or so he thinks, and he has a conversation, the Joe character, who is Death, with Bill, in which he's sort of ostensibly almost asking for the hand of the young woman in marriage from the father, which is a classic scene that has played out a lot in art and literature. But really he doesn't need Bill's permission, and he lets Bill know that he's just going to take her if he wants her, because he can, and because he loves her. And Bill says, no, you don't love her, you don't understand what love is. I'm paraphrasing. Love means to sacrifice yourself for the other, to want what is best for the other. It doesn't mean just taking what on earth, or you could say what in hell you want, what the hell you want, because you can. And so now Death faces a decision. Is he going to take Joe, Death, is he going to take Susan to the other world, out of life, to the underworld, however you might describe it? Or is he going to sacrifice his so-called love with her so that she can remain alive? And I'm reminded of a quote I mentioned in a previous video by the philosopher Alan Bloom, that Eros is love's mad self-forgetting. Eros, true love, in its broadest sense, is to forget the self, to go beyond the self, to sacrifice the self for the other. Not necessarily in death, but to really put the other ahead of oneself. And so it proves that in fact Death decides to leave, and as he's already decided to leave, they embrace, Joe and Susan, Joe, the Death character, and she can feel this chill more than ever. She can feel that it's not really him, he's not really present. He is already on his way, she doesn't know, to the other world, the underworld. And so he leaves. And in Orthodox Christianity, every Sunday we sing, Christ is risen from the grave, trampling down death by death. Christ is in fact risen from the dead. I've misquoted it. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the tombs bestowing life. So this is the ultimate victory of death, of life over death, of love over death, as in the cross, as in Christ's sacrifice on the cross, to give himself, to give up his human life for humanity. And love must win. Love is stronger than death. And shortly after the scene where the Joe character walks over a bridge, he then comes back, or rather Brad Pitt comes back over the bridge, and we sense what has happened, which is that Brad Pitt has been restored to life now that death has left him, and they have a reunion scene. And now Susan has returned to innocence, in a sense. The character which was called Joe, which now doesn't have a name, he didn't at the beginning and he doesn't now yet at the end of the film, has returned to his human self, to life. Susan has returned to her connection with life in the form of this more innocent love, this true love, the possibility of true love. And Bill has died, in fact, and a man who was very caught up in power and money and influence, towards the end of the film really had a total realization of his love for his daughter. He has another daughter in the film who I didn't mention, who's a more minor character. His love, he realizes that love is the most important thing, and he gives up his life happily knowing that he is loved and he loves. And so love wins, love is stronger than death. And that is really the message that I'm getting from this film very strongly, and that I was interested in looking at in this video. So I hope you enjoyed this discussion of Meet Joe Black, and I would love it if you would like, comment, share or subscribe, and I look forward to continuing this journey into the sacred in arts and literature with you.